Okay, so we all came here to hear from Professor Guy Standing. He talks frequently about commons dividends and basic income. He's probably one of the foremost experts in the world on basic income. He's personally driven a lot of the early trials that happened around the world. He convinced one of the major UK parties to run on basic income in one of the previous elections. And he was personally a huge inspiration on my journey and the journey to founding UBI Works. In fact, oops, not this again. In fact, I met him in 2017. That's long before I had this beard, and at the Basic Income Nova Scotia conference. And it was just a really great opportunity to talk to him. And I told him about my personal quest to spend 4 years working on basic income and creating a team to promote it in Canada. And he was very excited about that. And he asked if I could find some rich people to fund basic incomes in Africa, because he wants to prove that people will stop poaching animals if the communities there had the means to have the time to do that, which is an interesting question for him, because one of my kind of shticks at the time was why entrepreneurs and the 1% should promote basic income. And I organized 100 CEOs in Canada to endorse basic income. You can see their letter at ceos4basicincome.ca. So our journey kind of started after, not because of Guy Standing, but very much inspired by him. So those of you know about UBI Works. And so we spent 5 years since then with a small team promoting basic income, working along with Sheila and other groups in Canada, and many of you on this call who are activists promoting basic income in Canada. And I feel that we've had some impact. Those of you may not know, we've generated over 800,000 emails to officials at all levels of government in the last 5 years from our petitions. We funded research that shows that basic income will grow the economy. You know, despite the how awkward it might be to talk about basic income in the context of economic growth. Even Guy Standing says we should stop fetishizing growth, economic growth. But we do that because that's what I think the Liberal Party needs to hear and needs to say. And other parties need to hear this, and they need to at least know that basic income will not harm economic growth. So we've organized multiple marches in Toronto. And right now, we are working on, along with others in this country, to promote Bill C-233 and S-233. And I think we've been doing quite well. Just a couple weeks ago, actually, thanks to Rob Rayner. Rob, you sent an email out mentioning that an impending vote is coming and something needs to be done to convince the 3 senators who are not on board. So we emailed our list, and that generated, I think, over 100 custom personalized emails and phone calls to these 3 senators' offices, asking them to push the motion forward in the committee. And that's at least 100 we know of who bothered to let us know that they did it. So thanks, Rob, for the kick in the butt. And thank you, all of our activists who took action. It's really something. And those 3 senators know how much this really matters to Canadians. So again, I'm not Guy Standing. He's not here yet, but I promise to kind of contextualize some of his work. So but Guy Standing is a little different from the narrative and the conversation in Canada. You know, we're all for basic income now for the reasons of reducing poverty, income inequality, you know, the symptoms these have on society, modernizing our safety net. But Guy Standing also stands for a different message, a different economic reform that would underpin not a guaranteed basic income, but what's commonly called social dividends or Commonwealth dividends. So in Canada, after many years of promoting basic income of its own merit, we kept running into feedback that don't confuse the message, talking about dividends and UBI and talking about sharing in human progress, or stuff Andrew Yang would talk about. So we started Commonwealth Canada to have another conversation in parallel. So those of you who have been following us in Commonwealth Canada, we're looking at what Guy Standing would call the commons. You know, conceptualizing UBI as a shared return on the commons and natural resources that belong to all. And it took me many years to understand this difference, that there's an argument for basic income to reduce and eliminate poverty right now. But the drivers of poverty is the way we unequally share the value of nature, the value of land, of oil and gas. And Guy Standing frequently talks about in his books how access, basic subsistence used to be a right because we all had access to land. Land was free. Hunting was free. Fishing was free. No one had to work for the man. No one had to have a job because we lived in communities and shared the commons freely. And is due to 500 years of privatization of land that people got forced into factories and into the modern condition where people have to constantly outrun cost of living in jobs and are frequently living in precarity because working income, especially for the bottom 40%, basically will never outrun the growing cost of living when the value of land, the value of nature is being privatized to benefit a few. And I've noticed that this is really the crux of his message, is that it's not just that we need a basic income, is that we need to reform our relationship to these economics of nature. And that was just so, it was so big. Like that sounds like a bigger reform than basic income itself. And it was just really captured my imagination. So we started Commonwealth Canada to explore this in a way that doesn't do damage to the basic income movement in Canada, because I just can't see Senator Pate or or Julie Durwitz going up and saying we got to share in the return of the commons. We don't want to confuse that message, and we want to continue to push for all these all the progress that Canada has right now towards having a basic income guarantee. Because absolutely we should have a basic income guarantee. But if we can also then move on to create a commons fund or some of these ideas he talks about that I'll show in the next few slides, then all social programs will become more affordable if everyone is also getting dividends underneath their guaranteed basic income or other approaches. So at Commonwealth Canada, we kind of really took to heart his commons dividends ideas, and we're trying to see in the Canadian context, is it realistic? So the first thing we did was take, again, not just his ideas, but these are ideas shared by many economists. He's one of the more famous ones. And we said, well, what are the actual numbers here? Because he talks about sharing in the rental value of land, of oil and gas, of carbon, of air, where we have a carbon rebate in this country. Like he talks about this, but I never saw him put numbers to it. So we researched it and determined that, and this reports on our website, that the total value of unearned income, the total publicly created value from nature in Canada, we estimate to be around $241 billion annually. And this is just from nature. He also has other ideas, for instance, of like taxing big tech companies and taxes on banks for who use our currencies and many other ideas. But if you add them all up, they all kind of pale in comparison to land. So at Commonwealth Canada, we started to explore that more, because if all these together add up to $7,500 a year in dividends, I mean, that sounds good, but it's also not nearly as exciting as a $24,000 guaranteed basic income, which we could have for a fraction of this amount of $241 billion. So this is where we started to think, maybe we need to be a little less idealistic about this, because and let's just focus on land, because if land's the biggest number, how do we sell a land value tax, which is how you capture this form of commons and offer this money back to Canadians? Well, how do you even do that? Because that is in itself a major political reform. So Professor Standing talks about in his books that we should have a land value tax is one of the ideal funding sources for a basic income, because it corrects for the injustice of all of us losing free access to land. It's a direct way to ensure that land, which used to guarantee our freedom and our security, now guarantees it again by a land value tax paying for a basic income. So we looked into the actual numbers in Canada, and we determined that they could pay $700 a year as a dividend per household. This is not per person, this is per household. That was the math that yielded some interesting results I'm about to show you. But anyone who's gone down the rabbit hole of exploring land value tax would have encountered a philosophy called Georgism from the reformer Henry George, where 100 years ago in Canada, Georgism was really big, and many provinces and cities had actually had land value tax, and that predates the income tax system. So their idea was to have no income taxes, have no property taxes, just have land value tax. So it turns out that this amount could raise the 0% income tax bracket to $88,000 a year. And that might be compelling to conservatives and those who want to simplify the tax system, but that's not a basic income. It's just a way to reduce the tax burden on lower incomes. But we're exploring this because this seems to be, if we just want to get land value tax on the agenda as a first step towards ever being possible to contemplate Mr. Standing's ideas around commons dividends. So we said, okay, well, how politically viable is this? So we looked at how would this impact voters? If we actually did a land value tax shift to such a huge regard to taxing 3/4 of the rental value of land, and doing the Georgist idea of no income tax, like a less income tax, we actually found that most Canadians would be worse off, except for 30% of Canadians, often because the lower deciles of income earners have inherited property or they're seniors on low incomes. And if they're paying a land value tax, they'd be worse off. Now, in any realistic rollout of a land value tax, you would have credits for seniors, you'd have credits for farmers, you'd have ways to address these things. But the reform itself on its own, on a pure income tax removal perspective, would be unfeasible without those other kind of carve-outs and solutions. Now, interestingly, we discovered that if we just give a refundable tax credit, a land value dividend, so to speak, to all households in a similar way that the carbon rebate goes to all households, most people are better off. We see here really just the top 20% who own most of the valuable property and real estate in the country are worse off. And probably the top 1% in particular, we just don't have the data for that. So this is very interesting because it kind of comes full circle that if you're going to sell a land value tax, then maybe Mr. Standing's ideas around a UBI are the best ways to do it, because most households are better off. And from our initial look into the data, we actually think that a guaranteed basic income, a fairly generous one that has a very low clawback, maybe like 25% clawback, meaning that the guaranteed basic income credit, the benefit would reach all the way up to the upper middle class, maybe up to the people who make $100,000 a year would have a little bit of it. That actually might be the best way to refund a land value tax to people, because it would leave most voters better off. If you're going to vote for something, you want to know you're better off, right? So this is just mind-boggling after like 5 years of wondering, okay, this dividends thing, land, to find out that maybe a guaranteed basic income is the best way to sell a land value tax. Now, right now, we're kind of stuck for data. It's very difficult to run the simulation. We just don't have access to the right data to actually determine if a guaranteed basic income is the best way to refund a land value tax to people. Because I just think it's crucial, because as housing becomes more and more unaffordable, those of you who are new to this idea of land value tax, just go to commonwealth.ca/land value tax. It really would be an underpinning to solve the housing crisis. It would fix so many of the perverse incentives that are making things too expensive for people. So it turns out that this might be a complementary program that, although it's not a dividend, it's not a UBI, it might actually still provide the social justice inherent in Mr. Standing's message that having been cut off to free land, we've put ourselves into working poverty. So why not help those who need the most help first and have a guaranteed basic income that goes all the way up to the upper middle class earners so that it becomes more politically viable. So unfortunately, this is just a hunch at this point based on where the data leads us. We don't know because we don't have the data. If any of you are in academia and you have access to a StatsCan research data center or know someone who does, please get in touch with us, because we have the people, we just don't have the access to do this kind of analysis. I was going to tell Mr. Standing in this call that another part of his vision around taxing the commons is already here in Canada. It's Canada's carbon rebate. And very recently, they rebranded it to the Canada Carbon Rebate, which I wish they called it carbon dividends, which is more in line with his commons dividends view, that if someone is spoiling nature, they should pay, and we should all get compensated for it. I feel like the Liberal government has done the right thing to create the carbon tax and rebate, but they're they're not selling it in a way that has us feel ownership on the air. Because again, that's key to this idea of sharing in the value of nature, is that we own nature together, and nobody should nobody should privatize it. And oh, it turns out Mr. Standing has joined the call. Well, I'm almost done this introduction, Mr. Standing, so we'll invite you in a moment to do your talk. This intro was for you. Thank you for joining. So just to close, we in Canada are trying to bring Mr. Standing's ideas into the real Canadian context. So on our website, we have a deep dive article on exploring sovereign wealth funds and how Canada could have one. And so you can find that on our website. Mr. Standing is often saying we need commons capital funds to pay for a UBI. So we're actually trying to explore that. Just some of the funding sources that are in this article. As I mentioned, so far, we've really only explored the monetary value of land and natural resources. It takes a lot of research strength to look into these other ideas. If anyone on the call wants to join us as researchers, we could better bring Mr. Standing's idea to life in Canada. But these are some ways that we could fund a Commonwealth fund that can pay dividends to Canadians. And we got stuck in the Georgist rabbit hole because, again, if land is in fact the largest possible source of funding for a basic income, well, then how the hell do you stand land value tax? Well, of course, it must be the housing crisis. And one of the questions I had for Mr. Standing was, well, if we keep talking about land value tax, then how do we, it's easy to lose sight of commons dividends and just talk about the housing crisis and land value tax there. And I'm often in this place of confusion between being in the practical versus being at the aspirational. And hopefully Mr. Standing can bring us back to the aspirational today. So that's our introduction. So I'd like to hand over to Mr. Standing in a moment. But those of you, please go to slido.com. You can ask questions throughout the talk, and at the end of it, we'll go through audience questions. And since Mr. Standing just joined, I just wanted to remind you that we met in 2017 and had a good drink and talked about basic income in Nova Scotia. And it's a really privilege to have you here because you've been such a big inspiration to our work. So thank you.